good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The 2023 Constituency Development Allowance for members of Parliament will be reduced by almost 70% from 3.8 million ringgit to 1.3 million ringgit, and this due to the country's fiscal constraints. This 1.3 million will consist of a 1 million ringgit outright grant and 300,000 for service centre funds. Joining me on the show to help me unpack what this means is Dr. Tricia Yeo. She's the CEO of the think tank Ideas Malaysia. Tricia, how do we understand what's happening? What do you make of the Prime Minister's decision to slash the MP's constituency development funds by about 65%?
Okay, hi Melissa, thanks for having me. I think first to understand what are constituency development funds, I think not many people in Malaysia understand that, although it has actually been a tool that's been used for many, many years for members of parliament to help their constituents. And this started like in the 1970s already. I think also the second thing to remember is that this amount of 3.8 million ringgit is actually a recent increment dating from the MOU. So the MOU that, if you recall, Ismail Sabri government signed with the members of the opposition parties, that is when the constituency development funds had been raised to 3.8 million ringgit. So it was less before that.
Right.
So a third thing to remember before I actually respond to the actual question is that in the past, constituency development funds were always skewed in favor of the member of parliament aligned with the government of the day, meaning that if you were aligned with the government of the day, you would get much more. And if you were in opposition, you wouldn't even get, I think in the past, up to 2018 when Barisan Nasional was the government, the Pakatan opposition did not even get any constituency development funds at all. When PH came into power, they gave some amount, but nowhere near the same levels as what the government MPs received. So there has always been this complaint about this discrepancy between how much government MPs get and opposition MPs get. So the MOU changed that because it provided them equally to the same amount of CDFs, but that's not institutionalized. So the moment the MOU was over and done with, then it was back to square one, completely at the discretion of the Prime Minister of the day, right? Like how they want to make that decision. Okay, so what do I make of this? I think that this is it's a really interesting development. I mean, it was sort of unexpected that it would come so quickly, because what Ideas has been calling for, and we have really tried to call for an equal and level playing field where all MPs, regardless of their affiliation, should be given the same amount of CDFs. Because what do they use this for? The CDFs essentially are used to help MPs to help their constituents, meaning that they can use the funds for certain things like repairs of roads, building of small futsal halls for youth, repairing of roofs, all kinds of various infrastructure and developmental needs when the need arises. So it was used in the past for these reasons. But I think over the years as well, and I think it's a really good opportunity to talk about the CDFs, because it's an opportunity to reform the system as well. Because the question is really, why do we depend on our members of parliament to intervene on our behalf? When I say us, it's not usually the urbans who apply for it, but the needs are much greater in rural areas. But if you think about it, ideally it should be certain agencies of government, certain departments, welfare department, roadworks, all these agencies exist for a reason. And I think because the MPs have become so dependent on these funds and the constituents ask for it, there has been very little incentive for them to actually push for the reform of these agencies and departments. So coming back to
Right.
the decision of Anwar, I mean, of course, the reason that was provided was that this is a way to reduce government expenditure at a time when we are being fiscally squeezed. So on that note alone, we would welcome that, just because we think that, of course, it is important to recognize the fiscal needs of the country. Although this is nowhere near close to being able to provide for that. If you want to do that, then we have to think about a lot of other things like the Fiscal Responsibility Act, possibly raising revenues to increase our tax base, and so on and so forth. But
Okay. Just to jump in, I'm so glad you brought
up the role of different ministries and agencies, because my first thought was, what are the constituency development funds being used for, and shouldn't this have been under the responsibility of some ministry to fix the roads or to build a futsal, local government? I'm thinking works ministry, for instance. It brings a question as to what we expect our MPs to do. And what their role is, as opposed to being lawmakers and people who think about legislation and policy, or the person that you go and ask for a handout or ask for some cash aid or some help to intervene to fix something, some infrastructure. What do you think then, given decades of this culture, this practice, what would the cuts then mean for a constituency in the immediate term? If we have these types of cuts and yet there hasn't been reform for agencies to deal with these types of issues, would that mean that voters, constituency citizens then lose out?
So in the immediate short term, yes, I believe that it probably came as a surprise to most, and it does actually mean that the voters and the constituents do lose out. Um, However, I think over the last few years, because of the political turbulence, I also think that members of parliament have become used to having CDFs and then not having them, or having them reduced, and having that fluctuation actually, I would say, is a positive incentive, because it means that they would have to be able to think about other ways and means to help their constituents. And from a policy point of view, we actually have written a paper, so please do check it out as well on the IDEAS website, that eventually pushes for reform of the CDF system altogether, in which eventually these become obsolete and the money should be channeled directly to local governments, as you say, these agencies and so on. Because it goes back to the very question of what is the role of a member of parliament. In Malaysia, we have come to expect our elected representative to be everything and all under the sun for us. When in reality, if these agencies were functioning well, all they could do is they could actually inform voters that there is such a facility available and direct them to the right agency involved. A member of parliament's main role is to make policy, to draft laws, to debate, to represent the needs of people in parliament. I think there's also a need to recognize that there's three levels of government in Malaysia. So we have the members of parliament in the federal parliament. We have state government as well. So this opens up like another can of worms, because state governments also provide another set of CDFs to their state elected representatives. And at the local government, it's not called CDFs there, but local councillors are also given a very small amount of funding that they can use for their local neighborhoods and so on. So that's okay, because at the local council level, you know that those are the kinds of issues that need to be dealt with. But at the MP level, I still don't think that should be the main role of an MP.
Right. Okay, just a quick question about NGOs, because I know MPs do a lot of work supporting NGOs, activities, non-profits. They have activities, they apply for grants from MPs. Will that be impacted? Will civil society feel the impact of this cut?
It's true that NGOs, and especially the very local organizations, organizations that are linked, probably religious, clan-based associations, and so on, do get funding from the MPs there. But again, I think that this should be more well structured and carefully planned out, and much better to be doing that at the local level rather than at the parliamentary level, meaning that if we want civil society to thrive, then Parliament should be able to make available, a set of research-based or policy-based funding that civil society and NGOs can apply for directly from Parliament rather than going through the MP. I also want to raise one possible problem that all these years of practicing this culture that we've become so used to that we don't question it can actually perpetuate. And that is the problem where if you know and access your MP very well, meaning that you have that relationship, that's when the problem of patronage politics can come in. And all MPs I've spoken to, regardless of which party they come from, whether it's the ruling party or the opposition, all of them complain about patronage politics alike. And of course, we tell them, look, there's a way to change this system. It has to be a wholesale systemic change, because if not, this dependence, this reliance will continue to take place. So the problem of patronage politics is that if you don't have that kind of relationship with your member of parliament, and if you can't apply for such funds, or you can't reach out when something happens, when your drains are clogged, when your roads outside your houses are not tarred properly, uneven, spoiling your cars, then you can't get access to repairing those things. That is where the problem comes in. So I think just because we've been used to a system for such a long time doesn't mean that there are no problems. And I really hope that this is an opportunity to kind of ignite this discussion. In the short term, yes, probably there will be, some suffering from MPs maybe complaining about their inability to service their constituencies, but it is also a really great opportunity to talk about reform and why we need to move away from this system in the long run. And it's also about institutions. So we are a strong believer in making our institutions strong and independent. Hopefully the MPs see this as well.
Trisha, thank you so much for speaking with me. That was Trisha Yeo, the CEO of the think tank Ideas Malaysia. We're going to take a very quick break here on Consider This. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Let's continue our discussion about the decision to slash MPs' Constituency Development Funds by about 65%. Joining me on the show now is Wong Chen. He's the PKR Member of Parliament for Subang. Wong Chen, thank you for joining me on the show. I mean, do you agree with this decision to drastically cut the Constituency Development Fund allowance? How will this impact your constituency?
Okay, well, I do have mixed feelings on this. The most important thing to note is it's not actually 65, it's actually close to 71%. There's a 300,000 allocation which goes towards the maintenance of the office of members of parliament. And that is, that portion should be given to all MPs, irrespective whether you're government or opposition. The real community fund has been slashed from 3.5 million to 1 million only. So that's a 71% drop. To me, I understand the principle. Number one, that the country may have fiscal challenges, so slashing the fund is important to consolidate fiscal position of the government. Number two, more importantly, at the theoretical and at least the political level, is that members of parliament should not be dishing out money, to constituents, because it can affect how people vote, right? So, on that broad principle, I agree that the development fund is really not normal by Westminster standard, right?
Sorry to jump in very quickly there. In preparing for the show, I had a chat to a few people who aren't very certain, just like me, what development funds are used for. In fact, we're not even sure about the breakdown of what an MP's allowance is. So maybe you can give us some examples of what development funds are used for, or what have you been using them for?
Okay, I'll be very, very happy to share this. The first thing you've got to understand, the funds are broken into two parts. They're divided into two parts. The first part is what we call community grants, right? So in 2022, after we signed the MOU, the opposition was given 1.5 million for community grants. That grant has now been cut to 1 million from 1.5. right? Now, community grant essentially for me is very simple. I have 300 associations, Rukun Tetangga, Residents Association, Tempos, Mosques, Suraus, all these, as long as they're registered in my constituency and they can show that they're non-profit, they can apply to me and then I'll give it to them, the grant. Yeah. So these grants, I give about 2,000 ringgit per association. We have 300 association in Subang. So that's about 600,000 a year. The remaining 400,000 I keep aside for emergency spending, which is basically for people who have, had car accidents, fires. We also have a data bank of poor people in my area, and we give them about 300 to 500 ringgit uh, a year, not a month. 300 to 500 ringgit a year, and that helps them get by for 1 or 2 months. I mean, that's it. So it's a direct grant thing. Now, the other portion of the fund is actually called Mesra Rakyat. Well, back then it was called Mesra Rakyat. Those are for projects or community projects. I use them very simply because we have so many tamans and all sort of complaints about drains, road, potholes, and those kind of thing. Potholes, drains, I tell them to go to MPSJ to look for the local government. What I do is because this is a federal grant, I give it to federal buildings, which is basically schools. Schools are federal entities, Bomba, Police, Jabatan Kebajikan Masyarakat, JKM, those that require basic infrastructure repair like aircon for police, um, fire safety issues for schools, toilets in school have broken down, roofs have collapsed. I use that money to give to my schools, and I have 50 schools in Subang, 50, and I give them a flat grant. They decide what they want
Okay.
to spend. I don't go and tell them what to spend, so I give them roughly
Right.
around 30 to 50,000 a year, each school, equal, and then they come back and write the project paper, and they hire their own contractor. I don't even get involved in the contract, so
Okay.
absolutely transparent, absolutely clean.
Why is that your responsibility? Shouldn't that be under the Ministry of Education, under the Ministry of Works? Why are you giving money to upkeep of infrastructure?
Absolutely a great question, because obviously they're not performing to the standards that need be. I mean, I know teachers that have come to me and said, PIBG as well, coming to say that the toilet is really deplorable, but I can't get any funding. When the roof collapses or there's termites, I can't get any funding. They wait a year, 2 years, some have waited 3 years, right? I mean, this is the schools need to run, you know. So we're treated like in some ways like an emergency kitty box for them to do this basic thing. But the key point is this: if the government is much more responsive and the ministries are doing, fantastic service, fine. I'm happy because I'm wasting two of my officers full time managing this kind of thing while they should be doing parliamentary work, research, policy, right?
Mm.
So I'm not happy with the situation. I mean, I do enjoy getting, thanks from teachers and PIBG saying, oh, YB, you're so nice, you're so generous, you're helpful, you're responsive. That's political mileage to me, but it's not really my scope of work as the member of parliament.
Right, understood. And this all boils down to the way constituents view the role of MPs. Is it to fix your pothole and your longkang, or is it to make law and legislation in Parliament? A quick question about how you share that role with a state assembly person, Adun, who Aduns also get some development funds. How do you split that role? In your constituency, there's Subang and Kinrara, if I'm not mistaken, for state, at the state level. So how do you split those responsibilities of maintenance and upkeep with of being the emergency cash for your state?
Your
Well,
constituents.
we don't actually share or plan together strategically on what we spend. We are just responsible for our own spending, but the aduns generally spend on local community things like the taman. So if they want an exercise machine, they'll buy them one. If the longkang issues are actually handled by the council, that's local government. That's not even state government. So state government spending is really up to them. Local government, their councillors do have money to spend as well. They have equivalent money, in fact comparable to us, because I have 10 local councils in my local councillors in my area. They have a budget of about 100,000 each, so that's exactly like $1 million for the
Yeah.
MP. But for the aduns, my aduns have about 800,000, if I'm correct, and they have more money, spending money, than the member of parliament. right? But we're not trying to compare who has more money to spend. I think the others' focus is mostly on community matters, while we are dealing in national and international issues. So them having a bit more money is understandable.
Right. Do you see this as an opportunity for reform of the way our agencies work, our ministries work, the way politicians like yourself, MPs, are funded? I'm also just wondering how you might want to explain this to your constituents, given that MPs are a lightning rod for the emergency cash. How are you going to explain the short-term pain to a constituent versus hopefully the long-term gain of institutional reform?
Well, that's the real challenge, right? I mean, that's why my position is very clear. We do need to remove this constituency development, at least for very, very urban areas where the support level of ministries are in your face, right? It's all there. You can travel 5 kilometers radius and you'll find a government agency that can solve your problem if they are efficient, right? So to me, I think what we need to do is we need to gradually get the public used to the fact that we're not here to dispense money like Santa Claus. That's the important thing. But you can't go with 71% cut. You can't.
Oh,
You
is
know,
that too drastic? Is it?
it's absolutely too drastic. I mean, this is almost like a person has been smoking for 20 years. You can't ask him to, if you're smoking a pack a day, you can't cut down to 2 cigarettes a day or 3 cigarettes a day, right? So you do need to reduce it over time. So I think a 30% cut is understandable. And then every
Okay.
year you do 30%, by the 4th year, you have zero. And that by that time, then the election is just around the corner. Then there's no advantage for MPs with spending power to try to win election, where the populace is thankful to you for money that you are entrusted to keep. This is nonsensical, right? Because
Right.
we want to have a more better democratic system after all.
Okay.
But you have been an MP in government and an MP in opposition. Opposition MPs get far less funding compared to 100,000 or something compared to how much a government MP gets. So the current setup now is that we have a lot of MPs who have been both and who have had to manage with very little. Do you think that might be an advantage in managing expectations of what an MP can and cannot do for its constituents?
No, I think, look, constituents, I like to think of myself as being reasonably hardworking on the ground, okay? Reasonably hardworking. I have 480,000 people in my constituency, right? 230,000 voters. I have 8 to 10 programs every weekend. I can't, I'm just meeting like 1% of the people. So managing the 1% is not too bad, right? You every weekend you meet the same community leaders. You walk around the neighborhood. You see the Mr. Tan again and again and again. So we are interacting about 1%. So I don't think it's too hard for us to manage. Having no proper facilities for fire safety. I mean, that's so basic. Those kind of things we really need to do a lot more. So I think we can manage. But the point that you raised earlier, Melissa, about being in the opposition and the government before, and this is for Barisan and PAS, I think there is in the corridors of power in Parliament now, we are discussing with each other on whether we can come to an agreement and to lobby the Prime Minister and the government to just give equal allocation to everybody and get this
You
over
agree
and done
with that? You
No,
agree
absolutely,
with
because look,
Okay.
we've had a change of government in 3 governments in one term. What makes you think this is going to stop, right? Are we going to be here for 40 years, 50 years in power? Look, it can happen anytime. So just to be absolutely fair, what we should do is we should have a bare minimum of funds. Maybe 1 million is correct, but you got to stagger it, right? And then what you do is you give everybody equally. So there are 222 members of parliament. That's 222 million per year. That's like a drop in the ocean of a 300 billion plus budget, right? So I think that's how we should approach this.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking with me. That was Wong Chen PKR Member of Parliament for Subang, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching and good night.